spectrum. And in the middle of the spectrum is the historically accepted /
hang on a sec. I didn't actually press the go live button. Let's try that again. Maybe I'll just skip the countdown timer this time and wait till we're live. People can rewatch the beginning if we've already got 7 people waiting. Okay. I think. Just wait. Okay, yeah. So now we'll be live. Sorry, I forgot to press the go live button, so I'm skipping the intro video this time. So, hello. Oh, I should cut so you can see me. So, hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna, and this is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today, we've got Michael Granato on, along with David Hutchins and James Ungureanu, to discuss the role Christianity played in the development of modern science. And so there's a typical idea we often hear from Christian apologists of Christianity is, was necessary for the development of modern science. David Hutchins and James Ungureanu have written a book together called Of Popes and Unicorns, where they challenge the conflict thesis, which is the idea that science can... Yeah, Michael's holding up the book. Michael read the book and he really enjoyed it. So the conflict thesis is this idea we often hear from atheists that Christianity and religions in general are opposed to religion, there's a conflict between science and religion. They explain how this idea developed and what's wrong with it. And so that's not exactly the topic of today's video, but the research they've done for that book is definitely related. They wrote, David Hutchins, I think, wrote another book called Let There Be Science, which is a little bit more directly related to the topic. So with that said, we'll get right into it. We're going to be discussing. Michael put out a video on his YouTube channel a few months ago, challenging the typical ideas. We hear it from a lot of Christian apologists and giving his reasoning, and we're going to be discussing that and see how much David and James disagree and vice versa. So, thanks for coming on, guys.
Thank
you for having us.
No worries.
So, Michael, could you get us started by characterizing the view we typically hear from Christians on this subject and why you disagree?
For sure. Absolutely. So like I said before, I'm going to start from the view from 3 miles up, so to speak, very broad picture, and then maybe we can delve into a little of the specifics. But what I was saying is how I picture this is kind of on a spectrum, and in the middle of the spectrum, you have the historically supported and validated narrative, which, Arjuna, as you alluded to, is very, very nuanced. And of course, people don't really like nuance. And so on the ends of the spectrum, on the one end, I would say you have the conflict thesis, which David and James wrote an entire book about. So I'll leave that for them to explain. The conflict thesis, which they rightly point out, is still very much so a part of our common cultural conversations about the relationship between religion and science. I hear this. I'm in communication a lot with a lot of like YouTube atheists and in the discourse and stuff. These ideas are commonly still floating around, and I say, well, it's not really quite how the history is, and they get really mad at me, and you know how that goes. And on the other end, what I've noticed conversely in the Christian community is kind of the opposite end of that spectrum, which is the claim that Christianity, and if they're being generous, Judaism is somehow uniquely responsible for the development of modern science or played a special role. Now, to be crystal clear, I think that Christianity did play a role in the development of modern science, but the claim made by apologists seems to be that because of the theological assumptions and positions of Christianity, that this led to science, and as a result that Christianity has some sort of like epistemological, because of its relationship to science, has a special claim to truth as a result of that, because science has a claim to truth and Christianity birthed science. So Christianity by extension is more reasonable or more strongly epistemologically founded. Sorry, I'm throwing out epistemology a lot. I apologize. Has a stronger claim to truth than let's say other religious traditions would. And what I want to say is basically just to add as much nuance to that story of the historical development as possible, and say that science actually emerged in several different places, several different times throughout histories in cultures that had absolutely nothing to do with Christianity. So I will start there. Yeah. Oh, I can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
The way I've often imagined the claim was Christianity is responsible for the development of science, so Christianity is better because it produces good things in the world. Everyone should think Christianity. So I don't know if which of you want to start. So do you want to
I have a super concise little quote I'll share real quick.
Yeah.
It's from Rodney Stark, from a book he wrote called The Glory of God, that expresses this. He says, theological assumptions unique to Christianity explain why science was born only in Christian Europe. Contrary to the received wisdom, religion and science were not incompatible, that they're inseparable. Right? So this idea that science only arose in Europe and that it only arose in Europe because of Christianity. So,
I actually wrote my honors thesis at University of California, Davis, against Rodney Stark's view.
Nice.
So I think we're aligned there, Michael. But my first response to how you characterize the argument from Christian apologists is, what is it about what you see in Christianity that it's not different from other religious traditions and how they've approached the natural world? So you're pushing back against that Christian apologetical position that it was Christian theology that set up this kind of institutionalization of modern science. What do you see in other religious traditions that also encourage this institutionalization of science? I think one thing we have to also talk about is what exactly is science. So we're saying that it wasn't necessarily Christian theology that led to modern science, but what do you mean by science?
Yeah, well, it's a can of worms. Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. Unfortunately, it's not very, so I kind of have my feet in both the historical world and the philosophical world, because how my area of expertise is mostly approaching philosophical concepts through history, early 20th century reception of relativity in France, that sort of thing. But when I'm teaching like a big question in the philosophy of science, and I'm qualifying all of this because the statement I'm going to make is going to sound kind of strange, but it's actually, it's really hard to define science, as strange as that might sound. Especially philosophically, it's very difficult to define what exactly science is. And the reason why it's difficult, this relates back to a problem called the problem of demarcation, is because once you start to draw lines, you run the risk of excluding areas that we might typically consider science. So I take a very, very broad definition of science, and I would just say that science is a systematic in the sense that it's usually tied to a larger, either religious or government organization, a systematic fact-finding practice. I would say it as broad as possible, so that way I'm incorporating everything. Now, of course, that would also include things that I would maybe not consider science, but I don't know if we want to get into that. But yeah, systematic fact-finding practice.
Sure.
When I wrote the book, Let There Be Science, this one here, with Tom McLeish, who's a fellow of the Royal Society, one of the things we had to do in the book was attempt to define science. And you're right, Michael, it's almost impossible. And you can see that it's almost impossible, because if you pick up books where people have tried to do it, you get loads of different answers. So I think your approach, there's a strength in your approach of saying, well, let's strip as much off as we can. Let's try and get down to the most basic description that we possibly could. I think that's wise. And so I agree with that. And we attempted to do that. I'll read what we ended up coming to. It was, we will count something as science if we can show that it meets 3 criteria. So we managed to get down to 3. There must be an observation of something in nature. There must be a discussion of a possible cause. And then there must be some form of analysis or testing to decide whether that cause is correct or not. Now, it's quite common for people to add mathematics into that mix as a 4th one, and they say the analysis should be mathematical, but we decided against that. I think that you get rid of too much. If you say there has to also be maths, you can end up throwing out stuff that is recognizable as science, but doesn't have any maths. And so there's an amazing example, I think, in quite an unexpected source, which is St. Augustine's The City of God, where he hears a story from a traveler that there's an inn in Italy where the lady who runs the inn, she gives this cheese to visitors, and when they eat this cheese, they're transformed into donkeys. So he hears this story, and he thinks, well, he basically says, look, this sounds totally nuts, right? And he says, but the person who told me the story is a reliable person, so I don't want to just write it off. So then he begins thinking, okay, well, if that really happened, what could be a cause? And he starts systematizing and working through, and he actually comes to the conclusion that it must be a psychological or phantasmic effect that because he says, I just don't believe that cheese has that power to actually change bodies, right? Now, I think that's scientific thinking. It's an analysis of a claimed observation. And then he gives a second example, which is that he hears this story, which was a common one in ancient Greece, of peacock meat not decaying, right? Because God loves peacocks especially. So when you have their meat, he makes sure it doesn't decay, right? And Augustine, rather than taking it just as rote, he's at a banquet one day and they're serving peacock. And he says to his servant, I want you to take a slice of that peacock and I want us to take it back home with us. And then once a month or so, he keeps checking it to see whether it has decayed. And eventually he says, well, it didn't decay, it dried up. And when other meats would have been stinking, this one wasn't. And I think what you do there is you say, well, there is something, there's something scientific going on.
Sure.
In that process, in that thought process. Would we recognize it as modern science? Could you put it under the headings of, where's your results table, Augustine? Where's your graph? And where's your mathematical analysis? No. But there's clearly some kind of kernel of science in there. And that's 400 AD. That's way before what we would call the scientific revolution, and I think we see it, I think we see that all through history. We see these potted moments all through history and all around the world where we are seeing what we would recognize as scientific thinking. But what I would then say is there's a difference between individuals thinking scientifically and science with a capital S, as the world would say, this is what we mean when we talk about science. And I think it's this is what we mean when we talk about science that becomes the issue. And everybody starts talking about the 1600s and everybody starts talking about Europe. And I think probably James is the one to speak on this, because something happened then that was different, which was like a systematization across a large number of people, working from the same set of principles, interacting with each other in a kind of recognizable, deliberate enterprise. And maybe you could call that science with a capital S, but it might be helpful for us to have small s science and big S science slightly distinguished here, because the Christian teaching is that all people are made in the image of God, all people at all times, all around the world, and that their minds bear the image of God. And so if Christians believe that God is in some way rational and some way scientific, then Christians should also believe that all people have that potential within them at all times, everywhere. And that's slightly different from the what about the big S science of the 1600s, this organized enterprise.
Yeah. No, I really like how you put that. And I don't have like really any objections to the definition of science you presented. I guess what I would point to, so I want to say a few things. So the purpose behind this would be, like, if the claim is that Christianity had a unique role in the development of modern European science. I want to come back to this big S and small s science distinction because I like that. I think I could work with it a little bit. So if the claim that Christianity had a unique role in the development of, let's say, big S science, then my rebuttal, or how I would push back against that, would be to point to some examples in which big S science emerged in other cultures. So I think that the scientific revolution definitely has unique aspects to it. And I think it marked a fundamental shift in European thinking. But I think the use of the word revolution is kind of indicative of the claim that I want to make, in that was it really that revolutionary? Right? Because what I would say is that I think we have some pretty solid examples of big S science, other examples of big S science appearing at different times in history. The big examples I can think of, I would point to the Gupta Empire in India, which roughly lasted from 300 CE to 600 CE. I had to write down the dates. I'm horrible with dates, although I teach history. The Gupta Empire had systematic, based upon the teachings of the Vedas, had a very systematic approach to sciences that we would identify as astronomy, medicine. We want to be a little loose with our understanding of science, linguistics, psychology. I think psychology is a science. That came out wrong, but you get what I'm saying. And then also in Mesoamerica, with the Olmec, the Mayan, and then respectively the Aztec civilization, also had a systematic development of astronomical study in which they not only developed their own system of mathematics, but tested those mathematical predictions against observation from what little bit we know of. That's probably what they were doing. Of course, most of their culture was destroyed by the Spanish. But based on what we know, right? This is what they were doing. They had observatories. They, of course, had incredibly accurate predictions. The same thing is happening there. So I would say, like, yeah, I agree with you up to an extent, but I do think that there are other solid examples of the appearance of big S science, is what I would say.
So I'm not a theologian or a philosopher. I'm a historian by training, and I guess by disposition. And I can't really speak for the religious traditions that you just mentioned, Michael, but I'm reminded in this conversation, and maybe you've heard of this author. He's an anthropologist and a science writer, kind of a popular science writer, Loren Eiseley. Back in the 70s, he wrote a paper on Francis Bacon, and he talked about science not being natural to humanity. So this is where I think the definition of science gets a little bit more nuanced here, because curiosity, inquisitiveness are natural things, to be sure, but this kind of institutionalized science is much more than that. It has rules that have to be learned, practices and techniques that have to be transmitted from generation to generation by this kind of formal process of education. So it for him, according to Eiseley, it's an invented cultural institution. It's not an institution present in all societies, and not one that may be counted upon to rise from just human instinct. So the science demands a kind of special soil in which to flourish. And interestingly enough, Eiseley identifies that soil as the Christian faith, as we've been talking about, Christian faith. And he did so reluctantly because he himself was not a Christian. And he was not alone in making this observation, right? Other philosophers like Alfred North Whitehead and Michael Foster were also convinced that Christianity had actually encouraged the rise of modern science. And it was Christianized Europe that became the birthplace of this institutionalized science. So scientific investigation depends on certain assumptions about the world, and science is impossible until those assumptions are in place. And Whitehead described it as having faith in the possibility of science, faith in the possibility of science. And this had to come before the development of actual scientific theory. Another author that you might be interested in is John Hedley Brooke. John Hedley Brooke wrote this kind of magisterial science and religion, some historical perspectives. It came out in the 1990s. And he also argued that Christian theology has served as key presuppositions of science, but also we're going beyond just kind of the metaphysical aspect. Also, the Christianity provided certain values for the pursuit of understanding the natural world. You have this metaphysical conviction that nature is lawful, and it was inferred because it came from a rational God, right? But John Brooke also argued that Christian theology sanctioned the early sciences. Sciences was justified as a means of alleviating toil and suffering for humanity. Christian theology supplied motives for pursuing science, again, to show the glory of God. Brooke also made the claim that Christian theology played a role in regulating scientific methodology. And this is kind of the rejection of Aristotelian philosophy that was kind of encroaching into the medieval church. The rejection of Aristotelian philosophy kind of opened the doors for science as well. So I guess what the question I have for you is then, okay, so you mentioned these two religious traditions or these people groups. Why did not science in a institutionalized form develop in those traditions, whereas it did in early modern Europe?
Yeah, fantastic question. So I want to affirm some of the things you were saying and then answer that question specifically. So in my affirmations, I might forget the original question, so I might have to ask you to remind me.
Sure.
No, yeah. So I fully agree there. Like, and I was having this conversation with the other day with somebody that was giving me pushback. Where they were kind of affirming a version of the conflict thesis. The development of the university system in Europe, I think, was largely bankrolled by the church, especially in early Europe.
Yeah.
Christian priests, for the most part. I mean, just look at all of the natural philosophers throughout European history. 98% of them are Christian.
Yeah.
So, I think there are certainly there's certainly an economic argument to be made for Christianity kind of providing the institutional basis for science for capital S science to develop in Europe, 100%. There are even certain theological commitments that I could certainly see. So, for example, I really like to read about Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton predicated his entire natural philosophy on theological assumptions. Absolute space and time are based upon Newton's view of God. So, yeah, I'm on board there. I would say, to answer your question, why don't we see it? Can you state your question one more time for me?
Why don't we see the institutionalization of scientific thought, this kind of what you define as this kind of systematic knowledge?
Yeah.
Why don't we see it in these other religious traditions? I think the most famous example is historian Joseph Needman. Joseph Needman wrote a book on the history of science in Chinese culture. And he asked a question kind of in the negative way. Why did not the Chinese develop modern science, even though in the early medieval period, Chinese were far more advanced than Europeans, medieval Europeans, mathematically, technologically? Why didn't science at an institutional level developed in China, whereas a century later, it was in full force in Europe.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say that it did develop institutionally in other cultures.
Sure. Okay.
Again, I think the strongest examples of that are the Gupta Empire in India. Another incredible candidate, which I think meets all of the qualifications, especially of institutionalization that lasted for like 700 years, would be the Islamic Golden Age. In all of these societies, and what I mean by institutionalized, and I do think there are some differences. I'm not saying it's the exact same, but what I'm saying is I think that the differences result not from the religious suppositions per se, but from other cultural influences, mostly industrialization, I think is the big factor. But I'll come back to that. So,
but just to stay on that just for a little bit, because something that I've found fascinating in just my own research. I mean, even things like the advance of industrialization also had certain theological underpinnings as well. I mean, at this point in history, you can't really divorce religion and theology from politics and pursuit of government. And what I've always found interesting, just to use an example, just go back to Chinese religious traditions. The Chinese religious traditions have, especially Taoism, have this idea of Hu-wei. I think I'm pronouncing it right, Hu-wei, which is kind of the idea that to live a good life, one must align one's life to the way of nature. And that's admirable, right? But at the same time, in Taoism, nature is ultimately this mysterious thing, and it can be fickle, and one cannot really, as one's trying to go with the flow, as it were, with nature, it's kind of this fickle thing. So there's this kind of mystery behind it. Whereas in Christianity, and you see this in particular with people like Francis Bacon, who took the Genesis creation account and what has been now called the cultural mandate to kind of subdue and have dominion over the world, over the earth. That led him and a host of other scientific thinkers in the early modern period to take what they understand of the natural world sort of by the horns and control it and dominate it. So there's good things and there's bad things about that. One of the good things is that led to experimentation, that led to observation, that led to this kind of investigation of the natural world. So it's not something that we simply go with the flow of the natural world, but we take over, we control it. And that is possibly that distinction between Eastern religious traditions versus Western religious traditions, where the natural world was not mysterious. It's something that could be understood and something that could be controlled, whereas Eastern religious traditions said, no, we are not taking over the world. We're not controlling it. You have to go with the flow. So you can see there's kind of like a back and forth type, a little bit here, kind of a pushback. It's, but just from that's a kind of the historical perspective. But I'm curious about the theological perspective that you're talking about. You're saying that these ideas did develop, and maybe Dave can come in here and talk a little bit about people like Isaac Newton and other early modern religious thinkers who were within kind of a European Christian context, but whether or not they were Orthodox Christians, that's another matter. I believe. Yeah, you're shaking your head about that. Yeah.
I think we're. I mean, it's interesting that we're the guests on this show, the three of us, because when I watched your video, Michael, on this topic, I basically agreed with it all. And you said that when you read our book, you said there were 2 paragraphs, I think.
Just
2 paragraphs where you were like, not sure about this, but you basically agreed. But I think there's something very interesting about that. That we're essentially in agreement, and so what ends up happening is that what we talk about is the nuance. What we talk about is the complexity. what we talk about is the hang on a second. I loved your idea of the spectrum, and I totally agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
We're saying no, but we shouldn't be at 100% here, or whatever. And what I think is that a lot of what Christian apologetics is doing is reactionary. Like a lot of it is reactionary, and it's apologetics by definition is a defense, right? Defending the faith. And usually you're defending the faith because somebody has attacked it in some way. And in this case, you know very well, Michael, because you've ended up caught up in the middle of these things, that there has been for 100 years or so the attack on Christianity that says, well, Christianity is opposed to science, right? And not only is it opposed to science, but all the way through history, it has been a constant thorn in the side of science. And lots of people have made lots of money writing lots of books and making lots of films with those claims. And I'm a high school teacher, and that's what I hear. So I hear from the kids in school, oh, what? You believe in God and you're a science teacher, but you can't do that, you know? Yeah. And I've never had anybody say the opposite. I've never had anyone say, oh, Christianity is the reason that science appeared. So I think there's something interesting going on here, that the overwhelming view in the public sphere is that Christianity damaged science and held back science, and science survived somehow by the power of it being true to crawl through and gradually overcome Christianity. And then what's happened is, as a reaction to that claim, you have Christian apologists coming and saying, no, but that's not how it was. And some of those apologists have gone too far. I think that they have made an error. If they're saying there's no science anywhere else, that's too far. If they're saying no one else can think scientifically, that's too far. It goes beyond the remit even of the Bible's own teaching, right? Like, and it's clunky and it's twee, and so I can kind of understand why. And also, some apologists go further and they say, because Christianity birthed science, Christianity is true. But that also doesn't follow, right? Like, it might help the cause of Christianity if you want to argue for it, but the idea that because it birthed science, it must be true is a massive overstatement of the case. And I'm guessing that's why Arjuna has asked us on, because he's heard those overly excessive claims, felt pretty frustrated about them, and said they need to be readdressed. And that's all true. But my qualifier would be that the role of public intellectuals in educating the public is, you've got to be careful, right? Because you paint in broad brushstrokes. You have to. You simply cannot give all of the detail. And right. So an example that I would give is in physics. So my own field is physics, right? When we start teaching about dynamics and the movement of objects, the questions say, ignore air resistance, right? Now, if someone wanted to, they could say, well, that question's not valid. You should not even answer that question because there is air resistance. And what they're doing is they're introducing the next layer of complexity, but they're doing it in an unhelpful way that says, therefore, I'm going to invalidate anything else that can be done without that nuance. And it seems to me that history is the only field that does this. History is the only field that says, I'm going to bring in some nuance, but I'm going to do it so that I can undermine the entirety of the claim, the original claim. And so as someone looking into history from the outside, I think, well, this is really unusual because I've worked in like philosophy, I've worked in physics, and I don't see any other academic field that does it quite like history does. You have the conflict thesis that Christianity and science are opposed. You have the harmony thesis that Christianity birth science. And then you have the complexity thesis, which is where basically every professional historian lands. They say it's complex, right?
Right.
But what I think is the mistake is how historians then use the complexity thesis to invalidate all claims. So if somebody raises their head above the parapet and says, well, actually, Christianity was hugely beneficial to modern science, someone else will come in and say, but the complexity thesis, as if that invalidates everything that's being said.
Right.
And so in my own field, we wouldn't do that. We would say, yeah, we know there's air resistance. We know the situation is actually a little bit different to that, and that in the real world, you'd get a different answer. But in broad brushstrokes, we're right. And so I suppose if you think about a spectrum of, has Christianity been detrimental to science on here throughout its history, and did Christianity birth science here, right? The two clumsy presentations, I think, maybe. Where is the actual truth? Like, where is it on that spectrum? Because if you're going to, as a public intellectual, speak with broad brushstrokes, you don't have the luxury of adding all the nuance. So where do you come down on that spectrum? And my case would be, it's actually very close. I think it's surprisingly close to the Christianity birth science. Like, I would put it 90% maybe over that way. I wouldn't then argue from that, so Christianity is true, or so everybody should be a Christian, or anything like that. But there's such powerful resonance between the stuff that I, as a physicist, do every day in the classroom and the underlying principles of much of Christianity. So the way that I decided to phrase it in our book, because I'm thinking, where do I land on here, right? When I'm writing it as a paragraph in a book. And so I ended up writing it like this. No other body of thought has ever been of greater benefit to scientific thinking than the central tenets of traditional Christianity have in the whole of history. So I'll read that again. No other body of thought has ever been of greater benefit to scientific thinking than the central tenets of traditional Christianity have. Now, to invalidate that, someone would have to say, here's a body of thought that has been more beneficial. Right? And I think that it is safe to say, as a systematic body of thought, those central Christian doctrines, the ones that we talk about in the book, have benefited science more than any other body of thought has in human history. And notice that what I didn't write was no other body of thought has helped, right? Because other bodies of thought have helped. I mean, Aristotle's entire corpus, for example, in a lot of ways, I know that there were ways in which it held things back, but in a lot of ways made a huge difference scientifically, right? And so I guess I would sum that up by saying, yes, some people have gone too far, and yes, it's annoying, but that's not where the actual problem is. The actual problem is that everybody thinks it's at the other end. Like, everybody thinks it's at the other end. And so if we're going to be responsible, we need to worry more about the Neil deGrasse Tysons of the world, who have a huge audience saying Christianity is bad for science, than we do about a handful of Christian apologists who've overstated the case. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it does. And let me respond to that by saying the reason why I bring this up in the first place is because I think it's part of a larger problem and not the problem itself. So you are 100% right that the conflicts thesis has a bigger intellectual part in contemporary culture than what I'm talking about. But what I'm talking about, I think, is one facet of a larger problem. And the larger problem that I want to get at, when Christian apologists make the claim that Christianity had a special role or a unique role in the birth of modern science, I think this is an example of confirmation. At best, it's an example of confirmation bias. At worst, and this is the bigger problem that I see in other areas, not just in religious history, at worst, it is an attempt to exclude non-European history, non-European cultures, and non-European people from the conversation, which is systematic in other areas. So when I see that, I see it as, I'm willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, and I'm not trying to like call out anybody in particular. I don't think y'all make that in the least bit, but like when Stephen Meyer gives an hour-long lecture about the scientific origins and the relationship that Christianity played with that, and he doesn't mention the contribution of Islamic civilization one time, that's questionable, right? And so the larger picture is that for the most part, when we talk about history, what most people understand by that is European history or American history in my case, right? When I say I'm going to teach a history class, it's assumed I'm teaching American history. Now, American history is a little bit more, I don't want to say integrated, but America has a bunch of different influences, right? So anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. What concerns me is that larger picture, is the fact that that we're only sampling from a certain group, and that group just so happens to be Europeans. But if we take world history in a bigger picture, what I would argue is that big S science and this is a weird view of science, and I'm willing to admit that science has come and gone a few times, and maybe has the potential to go away again, but I don't want to be like cryptic and apocalyptic, but it could end. The scientific endeavor could end for political and economic reasons, right? And historically, I would say it has. So I would say that there are some concrete examples. Mesoamerican civilizations, you can look at Mesoamerican civilizations, you can look at Indian civilization, specifically with the Gupta Empire, and you can look at Islamic civilization, in which you have systematized bodies of knowledge in which professionals were trained in linguistics, mathematics, and observation in order to contribute to and to build up this body of knowledge. All three of these civilizations had schools. These schools taught people, that information was passed down. Those schools then split off when somebody else had a different idea. Just quickly, I would say that in Indian civilization, the theological assumptions, of course, were not Christian, but based off of the Hindu religion. And you have development of very complex astronomical schools and books, they're called the solutions, in which Indian astronomers back in the 4th century CE are talking about things like mapping out the rotation of the Earth, arguing for like heliocentric views of the universe, calculating the circumference of the Earth. And this is not just a singular individual. These are entire schools of thought that are dedicated to this. Now, what starts to happen is that there starts to be a lot of infighting in those schools. And with the economic decline of the Gupta Empire, those schools were no longer able to sustain themselves. So those elite group of people that were trained kind of slowly disappeared. And that happened in Islamic civilization at the end of the Islamic Golden Age, and it happened with the Aztec civilization with the arrival of Europeans. So that would be my general claim, that I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I would just say that let's have a bigger view of history.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because exactly the same thing is happening then, because what's produced the works and the writings and the Stephen Meyer lectures, what's produced that has been people making the opposite case loudly, and then people saying, hang on, it's not like that. And now the same thing is happening again, because this time you're looking at it and saying, well, hang on, these people are ruling out an entire section, and now they need to be defended. So we're seeing a second cycle almost. And I wonder whether the solution to that is, again, it's got to be a public education issue, right? Like, somebody needs to write a good book about the Gupta Empire that gets into the public consciousness, or it needs to be on a curriculum, and that kind of thing. Like this is the solution. And so I wonder whether really what's driving you in saying, hang on, I'm seeing some stuff here that's not right and I want to correct it, is exactly what Stephen Meyer is doing. And now you're doing it, it's like circles on circles, epicycles on epicycles. And when people are doing it properly, what happens is that the public gets educated, right? That's what we want to do. We want to move towards the truth. And I suppose, it was outside of the remit of our book. We're writing a book about the conflict thesis. We're writing a book about the idea that the Christian church threw scientists in prison or burned them at the stake or taught everyone the earth was flat, or we're responding to that. And then perhaps there's now a next set of responses to be made as well, of the likes that you describe, where, a really good TV series like on Netflix, or a really good, well-written book by somebody writing into, you might be the guy, Michael, right? You might be the guy. That we're addressing, in each case, we're addressing something where you think, no, this statement is too much. This, it's got out of hand here, and the things that are getting into the public mind is too much. And I suppose I landed in a space where every day of my working life, almost, I was facing a conflict thesis. And so I'm writing against that. And then you're in a situation where you're listening to this and going, yeah, but what about all the other stuff? And so then you can do this video and you can have your channel and so on. And, I don't think that Christians have anything to be scared of at all if they hear that that these things have been happening in other times and other places, because we believe that these people are God's children. They're created by God in His image, and we would expect to see the same levels of creativity and wonder. The Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God. It's no coincidence that all human beings have been drawn to the heavens. You find astronomy everywhere, a fascination with it, because it takes us somewhere else, doesn't it? It's transcendental. So I guess what I'm saying, Michael, is I think what's driving you is the same thing that's driving Rodney Stark or Stephen Meyer, and maybe the lesson from them is, well, look, you think they've gone too far, they've overstated their case. So if you're going to do this, don't fall into the same trap. And then end up overstating your case as well, because then you're going to produce a third cycle who are like, I'm going to write a book about how the Gupta Empire has been overstated to be a controversy.
Let me just add this, Michael. You're right. You're absolutely right. You look at people like Copernicus, and Copernicus relied on Arabic astronomical data for his work. So, but there's a lot of scholarship on all of this. It's just very complicated scholarship, and it's not made for popular readership. And because of that, and Dave was mentioning, because of that stuff gets ignored a lot. I have a friend at York University in Canada. Bernie Lightman has started publishing this series through University of Pittsburgh Press on this global history of science. And you might be able to find some of that work. And he's trying his best to kind of popularize this more global understanding of the rise of modern science. So he's looking at Jewish sources, he's looking at Arabic sources, Hindu sources. So that work's out there, right? But it's not made for a general audience. And I think that's why a lot of people are ignoring it, and maybe you're reacting to that. So it's available. But just, I don't know how much more time we have here, but what's really interesting also with the rise of modern science is how Christians, surprisingly, through their theology, has sort of de-deified the natural world, de-deified. So you look at ancient Near Eastern traditions, and a lot of their understanding of the natural world was full of this kind of animistic spirit. Though the world is full of spirits, there's a spirit behind a rock or a tree. So it's in that sense, it's fickle in that sense, because you don't know if this spirit would be happy with you or not. So, and what's interesting about the creation narrative in Genesis, it's very much what one scholar called a polemical theology. You see the author of the book of Genesis reacting against ancient Near Eastern traditions. In the very beginning, there's God, and God is creating these things, these astronomical celestial observations. They're not full of divinity or some kind of personified nature, but they're just natural. And it's interesting because it was Christian authors and scientists, natural philosophers who continued this process of taking any kind of animistic spiritual element away from the natural world. But as you probably know, that had some kind of negative consequences for the Christian religion. It will end up, you look at science textbooks today and you see no mention of theology or God in it. And that actually has a long Protestant pedigree. It has a long Protestant history for that process. So it's complicated. Yeah.
Yeah. 100% agree with you there. I mean, I think that and when I talk about the contemporary science, I'm of course referring to European science, right? So, especially 18th and 19th century science. I do think that the early scientific revolution is like big man science, in the sense that Newton's shouldering all the work alone. I mean, he's a special case, and I love explaining Newton to my students. But yeah, he's just doing everything by himself by the time he's like 25 or something. Anyway, crazy stuff. But once you get into like the 18th and 19th century, it's much more of a organized group effort. You get like the professional sciences and stuff like that. But I would say that this might be a different topic for a different day, but to agree with what you're saying, James, modern atheism arose out of some of the ideas of Protestant Christianity. Naturalism kind of arose out of some of the ideas of Protestant Christianity. I don't know if Protestants want to fully accept that, but yeah.
Right. I mean, it's really kind of part of Dave and I's our own historical narrative in the book of Popes and Unicorns. So it's kind of one of the unintended consequences of the Protestant Reformation, but that could be for another discussion.
I'm loving.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking through the comments on the video at the minute, the live chat, and you still have a lot of people saying we would be 1,000 years. Like one guy says, we'd be 1,000 years more advanced technologically and socially without religion. And you see, this is what I suppose it shows that this is the problem, isn't it? This is the big problem. That we can't shake this idea, even though all the evidence has been put forward by historians of science that, religion and like we've said, Christianity has been beneficial to science. And so, that's why my concern is that sometimes the complexity thesis that says, well, it's not as simple as that, does too much damage. It does too much damage to say, but what about the complexity? Because what it does is it just destroys the entire attempt to try and fix the problem.
Yeah, I was going to say that when you were talking about the importance of nuance, how like if Michael put out this little YouTube video or wrote a book with some maturity of how I disagree here, but I agree with them here, it's just not going to go viral. Whereas Stephen Meyer puts out a book making a strong case and people pay attention to it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so I suppose it's a case of, well, if that's not going to go viral, what's the story we should tell about Christianity and science, right? And the story we should tell about Christianity and science is, hey, overwhelmingly, Christianity was beneficial to science. That's the story we should tell, because that's broadly true, right? It's broadly true. And then there's another story to tell about other religions and other times, and those stories should be told too. And so I think if the nuance is always going to be done by the specialists, always. You know, in my field, physics, the nuance is like, so in quantum mechanics, you have perturbation theory. You do a first order calculation to find out roughly where this object is, this particle is, or whatever. And then you do a second order calculation, and you might do a third order calculation, but you're never going to look at the terms after that, unless you're like some kind of super duper pro, right? And we've got to understand the difference between our audiences for when nuance is right, and when we have to actually realize that trying to add nuance is going to stop people from listening, and that's a fine balance to strike. Like, it's a hard balance to strike. But I guess what I'm saying is, I think it is right. I think it's right to say, look, broadly, Christianity has been hugely beneficial to science, and we need to correct the idea that it hasn't been. I think that's the right thing to do. And then for people who are interested, they are the people that will pursue it down the road to more nuance. But it's the people in the comments that we have to try and help. Overwhelmingly, you know. So I guess that's where I would land it. Personally, I think that's because I'm a popularizer at heart. Whereas these two guys are they're special. They're much more specialist than me, right? I'm the popularizer, and these are the guys who can do the nuance, and so they're going to be frustrated because they're always going to want to say, but what about this? And I'm going to be frustrated because I'm going to say, but be careful, because if you say, but what about this, people are going to not get the big idea. They're not going to grab the main idea. They're going to throw the main idea out because you've told them that there's an issue around the edge. And but I mean, Michael, I think you're absolutely fantastic. And I think that, no, seriously. And I think that what you're saying needs to be a little bit of a clarion call. Like it needs to be, there need to be people who are going to do that work and are going to put it out. And again, they're going to have to learn to put it out without adding too much nuance to it because they want it to go big, right? So, yeah. I'm glad you're still here, Arjuna, because I can't actually see you.
Oh, yeah, I turned my video off because I'm having a little weak internet at the moment, so I'm not wasting any of my bandwidth sending you guys video. I'm just sending it to YouTube.
Sure.
So I think we're coming to the end of our time, so maybe we can have some final words from everyone. But I did quickly want to make a few comments. I loved James's point about how Christianity caused the deification of nature, or maybe we're just attributing that to Protestantism. And even maybe we could just attribute that largely to, was it Descartes, who, it's like, the mind body, he came up with this hard dualism, and that really paved the way for the theistic worldview coming undone, because now it's like, oh, we can just do science and completely remove theology from that, and then after a while it's like, well, we can just also not do theology and just do the science thing and leave that behind. Whereas I think in the Eastern traditions, like a lot of people who follow this channel and just see the odd video might not know, but I'm a Hare Krishna, and so I follow a tradition which comes from India, and I mean, modern India is very much not so Vedic in terms of what ancient Indian society would have been were it not subjected to the Mughal invasion and Muslim rule for 700 years, and then the occupation of Britain for 100 or however many decades that went on for. So we can't necessarily look at modern India and how they behave and how they rubbish everywhere and all sorts of mess to understand how these ideas would have played out if we still had an ancient Vedic tradition that was unbroken and uninfluenced. But I think we wouldn't see nature being abused in the same way. So maybe this whole thing of nature being separate from God is why there's so much pollution, and these ideas may have led to modern science, because it's like, oh, it just follows rules, it's just law-like, it's just matter. They may have helped us develop modern science, but they may have also helped us develop a lack of caring for how we treat matter, because it's not spiritual, it's just matter. Just throw it in the bin, just buy another one. Whereas it's kind of a panentheism that you get in Eastern traditions, where nature is in a sense one with God. So you don't waste electricity because it's God's energy. You treat all living entities with love and compassion. I mean, this also leads to being vegetarian, but that's another subject. So I'll probably leave it at there. Just wanted to make a few comments, and maybe everyone can just get a last couple of words before we wrap up.
Yeah. I'll just say this. I mean, Jura, you're right. I think if you look at the early church fathers as well, they had a very high view of the natural world. And what has happened, I think, with people like Francis Bacon and some of the early scientific luminaries, they took an idea from the biblical text, and instead of being good stewards to the natural world, they started interpreting that as permission to exploit the natural world. But that is actually not the biblical view. I have a series of articles at Credo magazine that talks a little bit about that history if you're interested. And just to say to Michael, thank you for the conversation. If you're interested in getting connected with Bernie Lightman and looking more at that kind of global history of science and religion, shoot me an email.
For sure. Go ahead, David, and then I'll. Okay.
Yeah, sure. I think I guess I've pretty much already given my final thoughts earlier. It would be that contrary to the common opinion, Christianity has been hugely beneficial to science. A few people have overstated that case. I don't think that the overstatement currently is a big problem, because I think most people don't know about it. I think what most people still think is the church ruined science and we would have landed on the moon in 1200 if there had been no church. I think what Michael has said is really interesting, and I think it's the next phase, of correcting. And people who are in public education like he is, I think that's what we should be doing all the time. We should be looking all the time at where are the misconceptions, who's doing the really cutting edge work up here, how can we access that really cutting edge work, and then how can we make it attainable to the general population, let's right some wrongs. And Michael, it seems to me that you're a guy that wants to do that. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, David, James, absolutely fantastic conversation. I might try to con you both into coming on my YouTube channel so that way I can ask some follow-up questions about the book. No pressure. We can put it off to a later date. But no, I enjoyed this. I also enjoyed the book. Like I said earlier, I thought it was a good read. It was a captivating read, which is incredibly rare for a history book. So by all means, something, right? So you can't beat that. Yeah, I would just say, to kind of recap what I did say, and to go even further to make an even more controversial statement than David made against the conflict thesis, I would say that you would be hard pressed. So my view of science is that science has arisen in several different places in several different time periods. And you're going to be hard pressed to find an example of that in which it's not paired with religion. It's not always Christianity. It can be Islam, Hinduism, and indigenous religions. But it's almost always, I can't think of a counterexample, always paired to it. So yeah, they don't hinder each other. The historical examples that we have just all point to the contrary. I'm not sure. I don't know how you can make the historical case for that. But yeah, I agree with you all on that point. I would just say, I would like to see more non-Christian and non-European peoples be kind of brought into the conversation there. And all of that hinges upon my definition of science philosophically, which is a bit more open. So I get that as well. And any philosophers who watch this are probably having an aneurysm listening to my definition of science. But anyway, thank you both. Thank you, Arjun.
if people are interested in definitions of science, I did a fun podcast with Seth Hart on is intelligent design pseudoscience. That one was a lot of fun because basically if you want to say something like that is pseudoscience, you've got to give a definition which includes what you want to include and excludes what you want to exclude. And basically, it can't really be done. You've either got to give a liberal definition that includes all sorts of things that you might want to exclude, or you've got to end up with things like particle physics not being science, or all sorts of problems. But yeah, I'd like to thank my guests here quickly because it was a great discussion. I mean, I love this kind of thing where there's the maturity and nuance, and it doesn't get many views, but I mean, that's probably why my channel's not very big. But it's nice to target a more intelligent, more mature audience and do something productive rather than just the typical stuff that we see that gets popular. And it might be nice to interview you guys individually so I can actually spend some time riffing on where I agree with your points, and let you guys explain some of the things that people in the comments are like, but what about faith and science and things like that. But of course we can point people to your book, The Conflict Thesis, which is a very good exposition of why the idea that Christianity has a conflict with science is inaccurate. And yeah, he's actually I think I got an image of the book. I can here's the cover of the book, so people can look it up. Rather than us go into your arguments of the book now, people can just go and read it, or they can see the podcast you did on Unbelievable where you defended some of those ideas, but probably other podcasts, and we can wrap it up there. So thanks again, guys, and I'll just quickly
thank you everybody for a great conversation.
God bless you guys.
Quickly say a few words about how, if you like this kind of stuff, be sure to subscribe, hit the like button to help us out in the algorithm, and you can let us know what you think in the comments. I may even be able to get some of the guests to reply to comments if they're intelligent and thoughtful questions. That may be a possibility, and I'll see you in the next one. Hare Krishna.